In 2010, Steve Sasson was given the National Medal of Science and Technology and Innovation by President Obama. It was a recognition of his work that he'd done in 1975, and it was work that later led to what enabled Snapchat and Instagram and every other part of digital imaging. But the name Steve Sasson isn't something that lives in corporate lore, unfortunately. Steve Sasson was the inventor of the digital camera, and he was the digital inventor of the digital camera in 1975 when working at Eastman Kodak. But unfortunately, Eastman Kodak didn't recognize that innovation. And in fact, they were stuck in what's called the industrialist dilemma. They were living in a world where they were afraid of sacrificing their profits of today in order to guarantee their success of tomorrow. And that's why today we talk about moments like that as being a Kodak moment. Instead of being a moment of celebration of life's moments, it's actually a celebration of businesses failing to see a future. Today we live in a world where more digital photos are taken than physical photos were ever taken before. But Eastman Kodak is not the ones leading that innovation, despite having the original patent on the digital camera. Today, the Kodak moment is a moment of failure, and a moment that all of us need to be thinking about when we think about predicting the turn. When I started my career, I was at Procter Gamble. And when I was at Procter Gamble, I was living in a world where I was leading our corporate digital marketing team. And in that world, we were looking at where digital could be the future of marketing and advertising. But unfortunately, we were having our own Kodak moment at the time. Because while we were thinking about digital as a new thing of advertising, you saw different startups such as Harry's and Dollar Shave Club and Honest Company that they were thinking about digital as a business model, as a way of doing business in a different way, to remove those competitive advantages that came before that gave the scale and the flexibility that was lacking. That's what these companies were looking at and thinking about digital as a new way of doing business. So today we live in a world where it used to be about fighting over market share. What Kodak cared about in their old world was their share of the film market and what market share did they have in that business. Today, fast forward, and we're in a world where it's about managing disruption, not thinking about market share from your traditional competitors, but thinking about a new world that we're living in. It used to be about digital as a media. It was an advertising tool, a way to reach an audience to communicate a message. But today, it's about digital as a business model. It's about digital going across every thread of your business. It's not just marketing, it's not just sales, but it's customer service and how you create and how you go to market. It's become a thread that goes across your entire business. And really what we're living in today is a world where there's a dramatic leveling of the playing field. The advantages of scale that guaranteed success in the post-war era just don't matter as much when we live in a world where advertising is cheap, shelf space is infinite, and shipping is free. Today we live in a world where disruption and innovation aren't just buzzwords, but a thing we're living in our daily business lives. And that's what predicting the turn is about. Predicting the turn is about this world of the high-stakes game of business between startups and blue chips. And what it's really about is a way of thinking. It's not about being a futurist and guaranteeing you know where the world is going to go, but it's about a world of probabilities. So often in business, we'll hear people talk about, well, business sometimes is about chess or checkers. And that's actually the wrong way to view it. And the reason it's the wrong way to view it is if somebody says they're playing chess in business, they're trying to use it as a shorthand of they're thinking ahead. They're thinking 5 moves ahead of where business is going, and they're being intelligent about that approach. But the problem is that's actually the exact wrong way to approach it. Because there's a reason in our world today that you can create a computer that can beat any human at the game of chess. And the reason for that is that in chess, there's always a right move and there's always a wrong move. It's just a matter of calculating the probabilities. Calculating what's that right move, which one should you do, how should you do it. And a computer can do that better than us because they can play out every potential scenario. But the problem is business is not that clear cut. We can look back in hindsight and say what was the right move or the wrong move. But when you're living in the very moment, there is no right move or wrong move. Instead, we're about the world of probabilities. And what we should be doing is thinking about the world and thinking in bets. thinking about where something might go, what's the probability of something happening, and how should we play that out. And that's where the turn comes into play. If you've ever sat down and played poker, you know poker is a game of probabilities. And at the turn is that moment where those probabilities change the most. At the flop, yes, it's going to improve your hand and it's going to give you cards that help a lot. But at that turn, it's usually that decisive moment. It's that moment where somebody that thought they were winning might start losing all of a sudden. And that's what the business world needs to be thinking about. How are we thinking ahead to the turn? What are the probabilities that are going to play out? Where might things go in the world of business? And it's not about saying this is guaranteed to happen or this is guaranteed to not. But it's thinking about what's the probability that something may or may not play out, and what do we do about that? And how can you put your business in the right position to succeed, to win, and to thrive? So as I approach that, I think there's 4 different mindsets that we can keep in mind about how this world is different and how we can start thinking about those probabilities and start predicting the turn. The first is this concept of venture capital as research and development. When you look at venture capital as research and development, it's about a changing mindset that we have to have. When you look at many of the large companies out there that dominate the world of marketing and advertising historically, they're spending anywhere from 2 to 10% more on their marketing as they are in their research and development. And they're doing it because they're investing in today, meeting that next quarter, that next annual financial numbers, and where they need to go. It's a world we all know so well. But if we think about where the world has changed, we see a different mindset. We see new competitors that are emerging that aren't like the competitors of old. PepsiCo and Coca-Cola spent about the same amount of money on marketing and on R&D. P&G and Unilever spent the same amount of money on both of those. But today, all of these companies have new competitors. They have new competitors like Amazon. You have Amazon as a business that one year spent $13 billion on research and development, and then the next year they spent $23 billion on research and development. That's magnitudes more than they spent on marketing, despite spending a lot of money still on marketing. And if you look at all of the companies that annually get recognized as the most innovative companies in the world, Microsoft and Samsung and Toyota and Google, all of them are companies where their research and development spending is oftentimes higher in their marketing spending. So why does that matter? Well, it matters when we look about what R&D looks like. Because if we look back in the days of Steve Sasson, if you were a great technologist, you wanted to go work at Bell Labs, you wanted to go work at Eastman Kodak, you wanted to go work at Xerox PARC. You wanted to go work at these places of research and development where you could have this great learning and this experiment and this ideation on ideas that might not see the light of day, but you could experiment and you could have fun and create. Well, today, as we can see, the Fortune 500 largely is not the place you get to do that. What you actually see is a shift. And the shift that is playing out is that startups are becoming the canary in the coal mine. Today, what you actually have is a shift of where research and development can happen. If you go back to the days of Steve Sasson and the original Kodak moment, back in that time period, only 1% of innovation, as defined as patents and R&D spending, came from small and medium-sized businesses. It was a place where that experimentation happened only in the halls of Fortune 500. But if you fast forward to today, we actually see a world where 25% of that innovation is taking place in the halls of small and medium-sized businesses. And a large factor of that is the switch of what R&D means. Because a lot of R&D spending today is actually venture capital spending. It is those $1 million, $2 million, $4 million checks that are being invested into a 2 or 3 person founding team that is creating something amazing. And what we can all use is use that as inspiration. You know, it wasn't very long ago in the industrial world that coal miners would take a canary down with them to a coal mine as their early warning system. It was an early warning if something was going to happen. And in their case, if something dramatically bad was going to happen. Well, today's society, industrial companies can actually use startups as that canary in the coal mine. They can provide a clear picture of a competitive landscape. they can validate consumer trends and interests, and they can reveal market opportunities. But we just have to have an open eye. And the best thing about having this open eye is that in the days of Bell Labs and Xerox PARC, that innovation happened behind closed doors. You couldn't get into those buildings without special permission. You never knew what was being worked on. But in today, the research and development of tech startups is happening on the pages of TechCrunch. If you're just paying attention and you're watching and seeing the trends, you can have a trend and a view of where something might be going. Now, the second concept we need to pay attention to is the concept of dominoes. And the concept of dominoes is about a way of thinking about extrapolating and accelerating effects. So there was a scientist named Loren Whitehead who was invited to give a speech one day to a group, a large audience, and he was meant to talk about his day job, which was nuclear physics. Now, that's a tough concept to actually communicate and explain to a layman audience. But Mr. Whitehead wanted to create a way he could explain it. And so he decided to play around with the concept of dominoes. And what he used the dominoes to do was to show what exponential effects could mean. And so in his research, he would found that the chain reaction of nuclear physics modeled what would happen with dominoes as you knock them down. And what he found was that one domino, just a standard little size domino, would be able to knock down another domino that was about 1.5 times its size. And if you played that out and every domino got increasingly large based on that 1.5 times multiple, one small domino, 29 dominoes later, could knock down the Empire State Building. Why that's important is today we're in a world where those startups are the dominoes and the big companies are the Empire State Building. And it's really easy to bury our head in the sand, to think that change isn't going to happen. But that exponential change will happen. And the thing is, it's happening faster than ever before. This change is happening faster than ever before for a lot of different reasons. You can see it with the acceleration of technology adoption. Think about how quickly Waze went into every one of our households versus the TV or video recorder before it. But what's also impacting is that change, because it's accelerating so much, is also causing second-order consequences. And I think second-order consequences are the thing we misinterpret so often, but is actually the most important thing. And it goes back to the first point, that oftentimes we measured ourselves by market share. We looked at our direct competitor, that company that we competed with historically for market share. And we thought about what they were doing, what they were launching, what they were doing as the thing we had to pay attention to. And the reason for it is that in the world of business, and frankly in the world of human beings, we're very good at measuring cause and effect. We're taught at an early age that if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get burned. But what we're not very good is thinking about potential and thinking about those probabilities going back to the turn. And second-order consequences is about the probability. What is that thing that might happen because of something else? So a great example of this right now is happening in the automotive industry. In the automotive industry, all the focus is on autonomous vehicles and it's on electric vehicles. And a lot of times we're paying attention to what does that mean for Ford Motor Company? What does that mean for Tesla? How does all of that play out? But what we're often not talking about enough is the second-order consequences that could come out of that. For the last 50 years, the US in particular has been a society of gasoline-powered automobiles. And to have a society based around that, you have an infrastructure that ends up built. You drive down any interstate, and we have the interstate exchanges where every single one is filled with drive-through restaurants because we're driving our cars, we need to get off. And we need to get off because we have to fill up with gas. Well, gas stations don't make much money on gas itself. It's a very low margin business. The result of that is most of these gas stations end up building convenience stores attached to them. Those convenience stores have become amazing sources of revenue for Altria and Frito-Lay and PepsiCo, and you go down the list of those that sell a lot in convenience stores. Well, think about those two trends of automotive that are playing out. If electric vehicles play out and autonomous vehicles play out, what happens to the gas station? What happens to the convenience store that's attached to it? If you looked and you talked to the CEO of Frito-Lay, Are they thinking about that cascading effect and the second order consequences that the thing that Elon Musk is working on actually might be one of their bigger threats to their business than just the threat of healthier eating habits? That's what second order consequences are about. And it's important when we're living in the world of business that any industry thinks about this. You're looking around and thinking about those cascading effects. It's something Coca-Cola had to deal with when they looked at e-commerce. When they looked at e-commerce, they were thinking about how could that change retail? And when they thought about changing retail, they thought about changing retail that sells Coca-Cola. How could they win on Walmart.com and Target.com and on Amazon? But what they didn't think about was the second order consequences. If they were right that e-commerce was going to take off, well, the resulting impact would be less people going to American malls, less people walking those halls. Well, guess what? If you have less people walking the halls of a mall, you also have less people walking by vending machines selling 20-ounce Cokes. And what they didn't think about was that cascading effect. How would the second order consequence of e-commerce accelerating cause the vending machine business to go down? That's what business is about. It's thinking about the probabilities and what could play out. The third concept is the concept of total available market. And this is a different way of thinking about market share. This is venture capital for market share in a way. And so let's think about an example of how people thought about total available market and getting it wrong by taking the wrong assumption. So we go back to 1980. McKinsey & Company was commissioned by AT&T, whose Bell Labs had invented the cell phone technology, to forecast what cell phone penetration in the US would look like by the year 2000. McKinsey had predicted that there would be 900,000 subscribers to cell phones at the time. Well, it turned out by the year 2000, that actual number was 109 million cell phone subscribers. So less than 1% of the forecast across the board. That was a massive failure of thinking of forecast. And the reason is because they were thinking about market share. They weren't thinking about a changing behavior and what kind of new things would be unlocked. Because they were looking at market share thinking about, well, every household in America has one telephone that's sitting in their house. So if you look at the penetration, what would be people, that's how it would play out. But that's the wrong way to look at it. Because as we know that the cell phone unlocked new usage occasions. Of those 109 million subscribers in 2000, well, some of those were people that had a personal phone and a company phone. Some of those were families that had multiple phones across the household. Just looking at market share is a wrong way to think about things. And if you take that approach, you're going to end up taking the wrong way. So the better way is think about addressable market. Thinking about what a changing behavior might be. In the world of skincare, we've seen this. The big skincare companies have always defined skincare as being a cream that you put on your face. And that is a great way to look at it because that's historically what the market has been. But if you look right now, you actually see the dollar and volume share declining in a lot of cases because of a traditional definition of a category. Today, a consumer is often going to think about something that they drink or eat being about skincare as much as the cream that they put on their face. But if you look at the volume share that's measured by Nielsen and others, they're not taking into account this. They're still looking at the traditional definitions of what skincare is. And the same change takes place in food, drug, mass. The definitions of what retail is have changed dramatically in the last few years. You might have been able to develop and measure the world of convenience in the past by just looking at the 7-Elevens and gas stations and other places. Well, today you have convenience commerce emerging in companies like Cargo and GoPuff. You have a company like Cargo that is putting a vending machine in every Uber and Lyft out there. You have a company like GoPuff that is doing last mile delivery that is 7-Eleven meets Instacart. Neither of these channels can be measured by traditional methods. So we have to think and change what our definition of a total available market can look like. But really what it's about is saying that aiming for X% of a Y billion-dollar industry is unambitious. Great companies change the Y, not the X. In other words, when you look at the world of business, you have to think about not playing in a world where we have been, but playing in a world where something might become. What might be the way that business transforms and changes and evolves in a new and different way? And instead of thinking about just being slightly better, how do you think about making the world of business that you're playing in completely different? One way to do this and think about it is the concept of market intelligence. The concept of market intelligence is what I call the so what that combines all of these other things together. And let's use an example to think about that. So back in 2010, there was the emergence of subscription commerce. And subscription commerce at the time, over the next 2 years, they had 50 different startups that were funded with $300 million worth of venture capital funding. And these were companies that were, think of them as the month or subscriptions. It was companies like BarkBox and Birchbox and Dollar Shave Club and all of these others that were monthly deliveries in a category. And it also gave rise to the meal startups and others that were playing about. And the problem is that so many people in business looked at them individually. They were asking, is Birchbox a good business? Will Birchbox be able to beat Sephora at what they're doing? Is BarkBox going to be able to compete against PetSmart? And it was this translation of thinking about these brands to their retail historical comparisons. But the problem is that was not seeing the forest for the trees. It was missing the picture of a change that was taking place. Because just think about your own personal wallet today. If you look at your credit card statement today versus 2010, how would it look different? Well, I can guarantee you that subscription would become a lot more prevalent today than it ever was 10 years ago when these startups were being funded. And the reason is these were the canary in the coal mine. These were an indicator that consumers would be looking for a different way to engage with commerce. And they were going to be defining convenience in a different way across the board of what they were looking for. And the thing is that despite this warning, people didn't see it coming. They didn't think about how this could cascade for their categories. An example is a company called Truman's that just launched 1 year ago in the cleaning space. 10 years after all of these other companies had revolutionized what the world of subscription commerce would look like, the big companies that dominated cleaning still hadn't woken up to the fact that people wanted something more convenient and they wanted to use it for a different way to communicate other values. So Truman's was able to launch to change not just a more convenient way to do cleaning, but one that would be more sustainable, with less packaging, less waste, and more environmentally friendly than buying a gallon of cleaning sitting in a plastic bottle on a store shelf. 10 years later, big companies are not seeing the change that's taking place and recognizing what to do with it. And the problem is, oftentimes in the world of big companies, they miss what the way to engage in this world is. They think about things like corporate investment and corporate venture capital and doing all of these deals as being financial endeavors. And they are. It's important to think about the financial side and the financial return. But what they're missing is actually the strategic value. If you look at the number of deals that you can see, probably of your deal flow, less than 3% of the deals that you interact with are going to be deals that you do something with. But what you should be thinking about is the intelligence that you can get from it. What learning can you get from this world and this engagement by looking at those other 97% of the deals? Because the art of engaging with startups, engaging as a venture capitalist, as M&A, or just in partnerships, is about the market intelligence. If you sit down with any venture capitalist out there and ask them how do they stay atop of the trends, how do they keep abreast of where the world is going in 5 years from now, they'll tell you they have an unfair advantage. And that unfair advantage is the fact that the smartest people in the world, the ones that have visions for changing the world, are walking into their office every day and telling them how they're going to change the world. They're pitching them on this idea of change. And that's what big companies need to embrace. The best ones are the ones that are opening their doors and recognizing the market intelligence they can get. Yes, it's about deal flow, yet it's about investments in M&A, but more importantly, it's about learning. And the value of that learning is developing a sense of how and when the future is going to happen and sharing that foresight with key stakeholders throughout the corporation. This gives you the ability to see the future of your industry before it happens. That power of foresight is an amazing tool that we're fortunate to be able to have. And you can have it by engagement and by thinking about how to do it and how to engage. So with this in mind, how do you predict the turn? How do you develop this market intelligence and use all of these tools at your disposal? Well, let me start with a story that comes from Jeff Bezos. So back in 2015, Jeff Bezos was writing his annual letter for Amazon, and he wrote these words. He said, "We all know that if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a lot, but you're also going to hit some home runs. But the difference between baseball and business, however, is that baseball has a truncated outcome of distribution. When you swing, no matter how well you connect with the ball, the most runs you're going to get is 4. But in business, every once in a while when you step up the plate, you're going to score 1,000 runs." Now, the thing that's fascinating about these words is that the year that Bezos wrote this in the annual letter was a year where innovation had had a shortcoming. And it had a shortcoming because he had launched the Amazon Fire Phone that had been a failure, a self-admitted failure. And it was a failure to the tune of $270 million that they had to write off for that investment because it hadn't worked out. But the thing is that when Bezos was writing these words, he actually knew that something else was going to be coming. And it was actually because of that investment in the phone that the next thing was coming. One of the early features that had been proposed for the Amazon Fire Phone was actually something around voice, and it was around voice communication. And it was a feature that never fully got flushed out in the phone itself, but it was one that Bezos had tasked his R&D team to go explore more. And so in that same time, in that same month where he was announcing the launch and failure of the Fire Phone, 4 weeks later, he was going to be launching the introduction of Amazon Alexa. And he knew that they had swung and missed with the phone, but the result was an opportunity to actually score 1,000 runs with the switch to voice that was about to be taking place. So when you think about the world of business, what I really encourage as you predict the turn is to think about an innovation matrix. The innovation matrix I love is one that thinks about core, adjacent, and transformational. And what's about the innovation matrix is thinking about a portfolio approach. How are you investing both in the core, in the adjacent, and in the transformational across the board? Because all of those things will have a dramatic impact and a positive on your business. So what are 4 ways to do that? Well, one of the first ways is what I call innovation-driven acquisition. When you think about the world of business historically, it's about acquiring things that give you market share. Once again, it's about living in that past. But the best companies today are thinking about acquisition that takes you in a different path. We saw this play out recently when in one day, Spotify announced cornering of the market around podcasts. Spotify had never been a company that played in podcasts in any meaningful way. But in one day, they bought Anchor, which was the leading kind of platform for creation of new podcasts. And they also bought Gimlet, which many people compared to being the HBO of the podcasting world. And what this did was position Spotify to become both the premier producer of podcasts and the leading platform for podcast creators. It's an amazing move that they were making. And it was made on a move of thinking about predicting the turn. Because Spotify had one fatal flaw when it came to their business. Their business of being an audio company gave them a world that the more you use their product, the more it cost them because of the rights of streaming music and everything else. So what they were thinking about was a share of ear. And a share of ear was going to be dangerous if they lived only in a music world. But by moving themselves into a world where they could do podcasting, they could change the equations and the finances. And so they were using acquisition as a way to drive what innovation could look like for them and what the future of their core business model could really become by moving into an adjacent innovation. The second approach that you can look at is investing in change. And Mark Andreessen of the venture firm Andreessen Horowitz, and previously the creator of Netscape, said it best. He said, "We invest on the side of change." And that sounds like a really simplistic comment to make, but when you double click on it, it's one that actually has a lot of meaning behind it. It's about investing in where the world is going, not where the world has been. And what's important to realize is that venture capitalists, whether it's a financial VC like Andreessen Horowitz or a corporate VC, they're not investing in a time horizon of where the world is going 6 months from now or 1 year from now. A VC fund is a 10-year instrument. And their best successes are going to be companies that change the world 5 to 10 years in the future. And so investing on the side of change is about investing of where things will be, not where they've been. In the world of corporations, a great example of doing this is actually Coca-Cola. While Coca-Cola might have missed the second-order consequences of e-commerce changing the first time, their venturing and emerging brands unit is trying to think about a different way. And they're thinking about a different way to learn from people, products, technologies, and companies that have a future vision of where things will be going. So this is the group that historically invested in Zico and other new products that eventually were acquired by Coca-Cola. But now today they're thinking beyond that. They're thinking just not brands, but where technology could lead to a shift. One of their most recent investments was a company called Iris Nova. Iris Nova has created one of their brands called Dirty Lemon. And while Dirty Lemon is a good product, that's not what the approach was. The approach with Coca-Cola was actually the business model of Dirty Lemon. Because with Dirty Lemon, historically, it's not been a brand you could go walk into Target and buy. You couldn't walk into a convenience store and buy this product, which is a really foreign concept when you think about beverage being usually an impulse purchase for thirst and others. What Iris Nova has actually done with Dirty Lemon is a belief that convenience is going to change. So historically, the only way that you could buy Dirty Lemon was actually through a text message. It was through an engine that you would have a real-time conversation to place your orders and to go about that. That's a changing definition, where Coca-Cola is not betting on the guarantee that that's going to change. But if consumers, just like 10 years ago with subscription commerce, they think about conversational commerce being the next trend, well, this gives them a chance to be ahead. They're betting on a probability that if this plays out, they can know what to do with it. The third concept is the concept of partnerships. And partnerships is where many of the companies will start when they look at this engagement. And the important thing to understand is that startups are like water. They're going to take the easiest path down the hill. And 10 years ago, that meant they were going to go for the people with the biggest budgets. But in today's world, they're actually going to spark to the people and the companies that can be the easiest to work with. Because if there's one thing that startups don't have, it's time. They have to execute quickly. They have to move to the next thing. And if you're easier to work with, they're going to partner with you before your larger competitor. But that's not something that large companies are usually historically known for. We're not known for being easy. We're known for 90-day payment terms or even 120-day payment terms. We're known for MSAs that are way too long. We're known for 10 meetings where maybe nothing actually gets done. Today's world, you have to be easy to work with, and that's what partnerships will be about. Luckily, you see some big companies, they're starting to move in this approach. If you look across the halls of most of the Fortune 500, especially the halls of consumer packaged goods, they're starting to have this approach. They're thinking about ways that they can do investment. They're thinking about ways they can do acquisition. But most importantly, they're thinking about ways they can do partnership, because they know that they have an opportunity to change the mindset from being difficult to being seen as great to work with. For inspiration, just look at what General Mills is doing with 301 Inc. Look what Chobani is doing with their Chobani Incubator. They're doing programs that are about not just financial returns, but about showcasing their ease that companies can work with them and engage with them. The final concept is the concept of disrupting the disruptors. It's at this point where so many Fortune 500s will look and go, well, what do I do about this? How do I get engaged? Where do I go? And disruption's that word we all love to talk about, until it actually starts happening to your own business. And then we retrench and we think about what we need to do, and usually we freak out. But the right approach is actually thinking about what gives you an advantage. Too often we'll hear big companies say that, well, I can't do that because I'm too big. You know, it's the old analogy of, well, we're an aircraft carrier and it takes a really, really long way to turn us around. Well, the thing is, going back to the example of Bezos, the biggest companies in the world don't have to think this way. It wasn't that long ago when Amazon was about a $350 billion market cap company that they launched a company called Prime Now. And when they launched Prime Now, it was because they'd been watching innovation take place. They'd been watching an investment in same-day delivery, and they'd been studying it, looking at it, and thinking about it. And in the summer where they decided to launch Prime Now, Bezos gave his team the challenge that they had to be ready for that holiday season. What that meant was 111 days after giving the message to go, they had to be in market, not just in any city, but in New York City, in one of the most difficult logistical cities in the world, to be able to deliver same-day delivery. But they did it. They were able to meet that deadline and launch something that was going about. And that's what Disrupt the Disruptor is about. One of the aspects of Amazon that we always forget to look at is that while they invest all of that money in research and development, while they invest all of that money in creating the Amazon Alexa and these other innovations, they're also really good at being copycats. Anytime there is an innovation taking place in the marketplace, Amazon is going to put a bet on the table. They're going to look at that probability of, is this retail concept maybe going to play out? And they're going to put a chip out there. When Rue La La and Gilt Grip Group were doing flash sales, Amazon launched My Habit. When Groupon and Living Social were doing daily deals, Amazon not only launched Amazon Local, but also invested in and ultimately bought Living Social. And with Prime Now, it was copying the model that they'd seen play out with Deliv and other companies out there. They're a model where it's about creating that innovation, but also hedging and having different plays. And the value of a big company is you can do those hedges. A startup can only go after one thing. They can't be distracted with lots of bets on the table. They have to have a 100% certainty about something they're going after. But a big company has the chance to disrupt the disruptors by putting multiple bets out there. Because remember, business is about probabilities. It's not about that yes or no, a 100% chance this is going to work. But it's about the 25, the 25, and the 25. How do you put those bets on the table to think about what might play out across the board? And ultimately what this is about, it's about a mindset. And it's a mindset I encourage you to think about from the creator of Ruby on Rails, where he said the sooner you stop fighting the present, the sooner you get to work on figuring out the future. All of us are at the moment where we can start figuring out the future. We can think about how to predict the turn and where we might be able to go with our business. So with that, I'll leave you with a few key takeaways. First off, remember that startups are the canary in the coal mine. They are the ones that are going to give you great insight of where things are going and how you need to think. Second, remember to focus on the probabilities of second-order consequences. Think about the adjacencies to your world, where things might go, how they might play out, and what you do with that. And finally, think about that innovation matrix. It provides 4 different paths for predicting the turn, from innovation-driven acquisition, to strategic investment, to partnerships, and to disrupt the disruptor that you can do against your core, against your adjacent, and against your transformational. So with that, I wish you luck in predicting the turn. Thank you.